Alright. As promised, we're back. This time we're gonna be going overseas and catching up with what's been going on over there. I wanna check out the video that I missed last week. So we're gonna watch that first, and then we're gonna see what is going, with actually, current events.
It was a series of stunning strikes on Russian airfields, damaging or destroying, Ukraine says, about a third of Russia's fleet of strategic bombers.
Vladimir Putin has promised revenge for Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian air bases at the weekend.
Russia just confirmed what we've been saying since the start of the war. Russian officials and Russian leaders have come out in full force and openly admitted that they don't want peace, they want victory in Ukraine. In fact, we can clearly see this in Russian demands that they are making in Istanbul, where the peace negotiations are ongoing right now. And this is why NATO is finally doing something positive. NATO Secretary General just announced that Ukraine will be invited into the next NATO meeting. So let's start from the beginning. What are Russian leaders saying, and why NATO is inviting Ukraine into a NATO summit? First, here's the statement from the Russian former president and current deputy of Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. This is what he said. To all who are worried and waiting for retribution, you need to worry. This is normal person's quality. Retribution is inevitable. It is important to remember, number one, our army is actively advancing and will continue to advance. Everything that must explode will certainly explode, and those who must be exterminated will disappear. Number two, the negotiations in Istanbul are not needed for a compromised peace on unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for our speedy victory and complete destruction of neo-Nazi government. This is the meaning of the Russian memorandum, which was published yesterday. Now, in a second, we will get into the Russian peace memorandum that Putin published. But before that, this clearly says that Russia does not want peace, they want victory. But that's not the reality on the front lines. Imagine if we had gone into Iraq and after 3 years of fighting, 1 million casualties, we had controlled less than 20% of the country. That wouldn't even be considered a victory. That would be a devastating loss for any country. But for some reason, Russian leaders are trying to paint this situation as victory, all the while Ukraine is striking deep inside Russia, deep inside Siberia. Unfortunately for Russia, this comment by Medvedev was picked up by international media, and everyone's now seeing the true face of the Russian regime. This is what Senator Lindsey Graham had to say about Medvedev's statement. Congratulations to Medvedev for a rare moment of honesty coming from the Russian propaganda machine. I appreciate you making it clear to the world that Putin and Russia are not remotely interested in peace. Unfortunately for Senator Graham, Putin doesn't really like getting criticized. And that's why Senator is now being targeted with a misinformation campaign that originated from Russia. This is exactly what we've been through before. Whenever we criticize Putin or the Russian regime, we get our videos downvoted and disliked to bury them in the algorithm. That's why if you guys can please help us out and hit that like and subscribe button down below, it truly does help us in the algorithm. But let's talk about the misinformation campaign against Senator Graham. You see, this started going viral just a few days ago on Twitter. Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal lavish Kyiv hotel bills exposed. While Senator Graham and Richard Blumenthal strut through Kyiv, Ukraine jaw-dropping State Department records have dropped on US spending, revealing their extravagant hotel expenses. On June 1st, 2025, two staggering transactions surfaced. One for a mind-blowing $403,000 and another for an eye-popping $411,000. The question on everyone's mind: what justifies this astronomical spending, and why this much? Then this fake news was picked up by everyone. Elon Musk was retweeting it, and we had Patrick Bet-David criticizing Senator Graham. When in reality, it's not really true. Let me explain. Fake news, more BS. I'm all in trying to help President Trump end this war and make sure Putin doesn't win. This is not a travel expense report. It's a monthly contract between State Department for US diplomats in a war zone. This has nothing to do with Senator Graham's trip, but people on social media
The
don't
fuck
really
is this?
confirm before they just blast information to their audience. And this is where Russia excels the most. They don't know how to fight a war on the battlefield, but they do know how to spread misinformation. Every other day, they come up with the shocking news about Ukraine, Ukrainian supporters, and Ukrainian leaders. And that news goes all over the media before it's corrected, and everyone believes that Ukraine is a corrupt country. If we really do want to talk about corruption, let's look at Vladimir Putin. His dad was a chef in Russia,
28 days
and
later.
somehow, now Putin owns multiple billion-dollar houses. I don't think Putin earned all that serving the Russian people. He earned
He was a
that by
chef in
exploiting the
Russia.
Russian wealth and Russian citizens. And now Putin does not want this war to stop because he realizes
Putin-tini?
if this war stops, he will be out of power. And that's why he wants to continue this for as long as possible. This is what he said just a few minutes before I started recording.
Но как же проводить?
But how can such meetings even be held under these circumstances? What is there to talk about? Who negotiates with those who bet on terror, with terrorists? And what are they
Dude,
being
you are the
rewarded
terrorists
for
that's
by
doing this
granting
to
them a
me.
pause in hostilities, a pause that will be used to reinforce the regime with Western weapons, to continue forced mobilization,
can't call you
and
that
to
as- 'cause you're
prepare
like the
further
government.
terrorist acts like those carried out in the Bryansk and Kursk regions?
И Курской областях.
Now, this is where it's important to understand Putin's situation in Russia because last few months, especially since Prigozhin's uprising, Putin hasn't felt safe in Moscow. He knows people around him are planning stuff. And this is something we talked about on your live stream with none other than Jason J. Smart. So I want to quickly show you guys this clip.
Because they say, well, how's it possible? How are the Ukrainians doing this to us? How's it possible? And they get panicked. You know, I'm sure we've discussed before, is that I was in Kursk, Russia, less than a year ago, just a few months ago. Now, that's a part of Russia, the southern part of Russia, that's under Ukrainian occupation. And so I was there, I went up, the Ukrainian military invited me as a journalist, I went there, walked around, and I walked around alone, by the way. So I had soldiers back in the armed personnel carrier, but I walked around without a bulletproof jacket, without a helmet, and I talked to people. I talked to Russians on the street, and I asked them, so what's going on? How are things? And obviously I speak Russian. So there's a background to that. And what was interesting about that was that, one, they weren't scared of the Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, I was surprised how often they approached in the streets to ask about, when streets were going to be open and when this was going to happen. When, I can assure you, when Russians are occupying Ukrainian territory, nobody approaches them. They're scared, terribly scared of them. But it wasn't the same. The Russian citizens in Kursk were not scared of them. But the second thing is, and this is the key part for me, was how much they directly blamed the Putin regime for their current situation, that is their occupation. They said, why did Putin start this? We didn't need this. This didn't make our life better. How in any way does this help me?
I
Why
don't
the hell
know
would
why
he do
he
this?
did start this.
And they're mostly
Where he
older
really
people.
couldn't
Because
have.
everybody under age like 50 hit the road. So their kids who were adults and their grandchildren who were kids had left. And I said, when's the last time you talked to them? Oh, all our family members ran away. And I said, well, didn't anyone try to stay here to fight? Didn't anyone ask for weapons from the Russian military so they could defend Kursk? No, nobody did that. And it's true. There was no resistance. The Russians just accepted occupation. They don't support the regime. And if you think that's just a myth, remember when Prigozhin, today's his birthday, founder of the Wagner Group, or the leader, I should say, one of the leaders, when Prigozhin rolled into Rostov and tried to overthrow the Russian military leadership last year,
Look at you.
what happened? Well, when he got to Rostov, and you can see the videos online, you see Russian citizens coming up to him, they're giving his soldiers food, giving them wine, giving them water, thanking them, bringing them flowers. You can see it online. This is not something that is just a rumor. You could see online the
I'd be
Russian
thankful,
senior
too, if I
military
was getting
leadership
free shit from the locals.
when he got to Rostov, which is, keep in mind, 200 miles from Moscow. When they got there, the senior military leadership came out and they were chatting with him. They drank coffee with him. They smoked cigarettes with him. They're saying, you really shouldn't do this. It's really not good to do that. But what's the most important part of the story? What we did not see, though everybody knew he was coming, they could see him coming. They knew where he was hundreds of kilometers in advance. They did not call it an airstrike. We did not see the Russian police try to stop him,
why
the local
would it?
police.
That's
We did not
just
see the
an
border
actual
guards.
waste
We
of
did not see the
resources.
National Guard. We did not see the Chechens. We did not see the Russian military. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody called in an airstrike on Prigozhin. And why is that? It's because the Russian military leadership was not sure who would win. They thought maybe Prigozhin will take power. And there's silence in Moscow. Medvedev, the former president, silent. Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, silent. Look at the senior Russian leadership, silence. And why is that? Why don't they say, well, we're behind Putin all the way? Because they weren't sure if Putin would maintain power. They thought Putin might fall. And so they're trying to hedge their bets as to what would come next.
Yeah. Medvedev also seems to be going crazy because I saw a few days ago he was threatening Trump with World War III. Like, he would have any power.
Which is just insane because when you look at it, I think it was in I want to say it was February last year, just in 1 month, 18 times he threatened nuclear war, World War III. So it's what he constantly does. And it's actually, if someone's really interested in it, there's a reason for that. And there's a very simple reason for that. Is that in the Russian, and anyone who's ever trying to understand Russia the rest of your life, notice this. Keep an eye on this. Russia has a couple different categories. The top category is, let's say, Putin. Putin never makes comments like, we'll start World War III. No, he sort of implies things sometimes, and that's really extreme. But what he'll never do, and never does, he'll never say something like, Trump or Biden is idiot, or they don't know what they're doing. Never. Why is that? Putin's role is to always look like he's above the fray. Keep in mind, it's a dictatorship. Everybody has roles. It's not like they just choose to do whatever. That's his role. He looks like he's above the fray. He's a serious diplomat. He's etc. But those who are below him have to be the attack dogs. And that's why you have people like Medvedev, like the popular press, which is Kremlin-backed or Kremlin-controlled, which comes out with these really extreme propaganda statements about, we could start World War III, we're going to nuke New York and Washington and Paris and Berlin. They're not going to do any of that. But they know that they have to project strength. Because the Russian senior leadership never says that. It's because they always distinguish between the two different ones. Putin's spokesman, his name is Dmitry Peskov, never says things like that. In fact, last week, when Trump said that Putin was crazy, Peskov said, well, we don't take it personally. Trump, we know, is under tremendous strain and pressure right now, and we appreciate everything he's done to try to reach peace between our countries. Now, why do you say that? Then Medvedev said, we're going to start World War III. They're playing different roles. The guy representing Putin has to say we're above the fray, we're serious diplomats, because that's what the Russian population wants to see. The ones that have to act like clowns, the propagandists, Sobolev and these other people, the drunk former president, Dmitry Medvedev, they're playing their role, which is to be the saber rattlers.
And Medvedev's also, I think he's following the channel or something, because we have never tweeted anything. We didn't start tweeting until like 2 days ago. And suddenly I just saw Medvedev blocked Business Basics on Twitter.
Really? That's amazing.
So he's going to see this, hopefully. Now, this is where we have to understand that world is slowly starting to realize that Russia doesn't want peace, and that's why NATO is moving. NATO is basically trying to step up to help Ukraine more. Just recently, we had a very shocking comment from the NATO Secretary General. He said that Ukraine will be invited to next NATO summit. Now, of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine will be part of NATO, become part of NATO, but it really does show that NATO is open to supporting Ukraine more, and they're trying to figure out a way where they can provide Ukraine with security without Ukraine becoming part of NATO. Because the US has made it pretty clear that Ukraine being part of NATO is off the table. Here's the Secretary General's comments.
Indeed, I invited Ukraine to the summit. We will as soon as possible bring out a program with more details. When it comes to Ukraine, NATO, we will have, and this is very important today with the defense ministers, Ukraine Defense Contact Group, we will have a NATO-Ukraine Council tomorrow, and we will continue having these meetings and making sure that we coordinate to the max. And the summit will play a role, absolutely.
This move comes along with news about United States beginning to coordinate a new sanctions package on Russia, and this will be done with EU, and this is definitely a very good sign for Ukraine. It's also important to point out this is not the same sanctions package that's in the Senate floor right now, because Senator Lindsey Graham has put forward or co-sponsored a bill that would put secondary sanctions on Russia. So basically any country that's helping Russia fund this war will face sanctions, will face tariffs. So those will include Iran, those will include China and India, who've been buying Russian oil and funding the Russian war chest. That means all these countries, if they want to do trade with the United States, they would be facing roughly 500% tariff if they continue buying Russian oil. That would of course mean that these countries will either stop buying Russian oil, which is more likely, or Shadow Fleet will just up its game. The Shadow Fleet that Russia has been using is basically a way of hiding who they're selling to and who's buying Russian oil. Now, that's definitely a good solution for Russia, but the good part about Russia using shadow fleet is they don't get the same amount of money they would have earned selling this oil on an open market. Usually they have to offer discounts, and on top of that, they have to operate the shadow fleet that eats into their profits, that eats into their margin. For an economy that's so dependent on oil revenues, this is definitely not a good news, especially considering that over the last few months, the oil prices are falling dramatically. Russia's oil revenues dropped 52% versus April, lowest in more than a year. Low oil prices and semi-sanctions work their magic. Now, this is exactly where the new sanctions will target. They want to go after Russian revenues, not really the Russian industry, because Russia doesn't have much of an industry to begin with. They're not a major economy. As the late Senator John McCain famously once said, Russia is a gas station run by a mafia state that's masquerading as a nation. And that's exactly what it is. And if we target the oil prices, if we target the oil revenues, Putin will be forced to give up his dream of rebuilding the Soviet empire. In fact, even Russian people want this war to end. They want peace and they want sustainable economy that's not dependent on just producing wartime stuff. Because as we'll soon see, everything Russia is producing is just getting destroyed by Ukraine with $300 drones. That's not really adding to the economy, even though it shows GDP growth for that year. Russia is not really building anything long term. But first, let's go through this interview of the Russian people and what they think about war and negotiations.
I'm depressed by all these wars, by everything that's going on. I can't find a permanent job. The most important thing is peace. Most people want peace, and for the war to end as soon as possible. That's my one wish.
Are you affected by this war here in Moscow?
Of course. I have a friend whose son's fighting in the war. We worry about him. He's young, 26 years old, so it certainly does affect us. With every day that passes, it's more and more frightening. People like me, we've lived half a century. We've lived our lives, but our children, our grandchildren, what will they grow up to see?
What hopes do you have? What do you hope for in the future? What do I hope for? We must have stability. Then all our hopes will work out. How can this stability be achieved? That's a difficult question. It's more to do with politics.
I have friends who are all worried. Many have family who are fighting in the war. Nephews or their own children.
Now this is where I want to tackle some of the comments I know we will get, because every time we talk about the Russian economy, someone always brings up the statistic that Russia publishes saying that their economy is growing. And yes, it is growing. It's quite likely that they're not lying about the GDP growth. But let's think about how the economy is growing. You see, all the Russian factories have been refocused on defense industry. So basically, they're producing stuff that Russia needs for the war. Let's say they produced $100 million in planes, right? In bombers. Now that adds to the Russian GDP. It shows that Russian GDP just produced something that was $100 million. But is that something that's really long term? Because let's not just talk about bombers, let's talk about tanks. Russia is re-engineering a lot of old tanks that shows GDP growth, but then these tanks go to the front lines and get destroyed. Even though Russia has had GDP growth, the citizens are not actually benefiting from the economic growth because Russia is not creating something that's long term. Now the second part of that is coming back to the bombers. Ukraine is destroying the GDP growth that Russia is having with very little spending of their own. Let's talk about the Operation Spiderweb. Ukraine has brought the war to a new level. It's the main feedback for Ukraine's recent operation in Russia. The Spiderweb operation showed that it is possible to destroy an aircraft worth more than $100 million with just a $600 drone, which means anything can be destroyed that way. This makes the world reconsider military strategy and realize vulnerabilities of military facilities, as well as reconsider priorities in military-industrial complex. Ukraine did this. We had to do this because we are fighting an existential war, a war for survival against world's largest nuclear power. It's a David versus Goliath, fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, without enough weapons, with bans and restrictions. clearly, operation was a big deal, especially considering how much damage Ukraine claims they have done. Now, everyone has their reasons for lying. Russia wants to understate whatever damage was done, and Ukraine wants to overstate whatever damage was done. According to some Ukrainian sources on the first day, roughly $7 billion in bombers were destroyed because of this attack. But according to Russian sources, only 2 bombers were destroyed. So clearly both sides have their versions of the story, but this is where satellite imagery helps us out tremendously. So here we have Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, publishing before and after photo of one of the bases, the Siberian base Belaya, that was targeted by Ukraine. So let's watch this and then we'll break down what we can see in this satellite image. At least 11 strategic bombers were destroyed there, 7 Tu-95s, 4 Tu-20T M3s. In addition, 1 AN-12 transport aircraft was damaged. Now, of course, this is just one base, but it's quite likely that this was the biggest base that was attacked, so most of the damage was at this base, but Ukraine also attacked 3 other bases. So it's likely that Russia lost many more aircrafts if we consider all the other bases.
The attack today is something that will degrade Russia's ability to project strength in the Arctic, we're talking in the Atlantic, we're talking against Ukraine, against Europe, in the Pacific. This is huge and a major setback, by far the largest loss that Russia has taken since June 22nd, 1941, when Nazi Germany.
Yeah, my voice is probably full of shit. Yeah, they're getting fucked by Ukraine right now.
Putin said the invasion of Ukraine is a matter of weeks. That was 3 years ago.
The price for Putin's war has been paid in blood. Putin's most sickening statistic has been revealed. Russia has officially suffered almost 1 million casualties in the war and is on track to break through the 1 million mark by the end of June.
The reason for this death toll is the sheer size of Russian military personnel. Why spend billions on war machines when you can send waves of soldiers to their deaths? So when will this bloodshed end? Only time will tell us.
Oh man.
The Russia-Ukraine war is so relentless, it has killed or wounded a soldier every single minute for 3 years straight. Day after day, night after night, human lives are traded for mere inches of territory. Recent reports estimate that nearly 1 million Russian troops have been killed or wounded since the full-scale invasion started. This includes over 5,000 officers, among them at least 10 generals and more than 500 colonels and lieutenant colonels. Early in the invasion, about 1 in every 5 confirmed Russian fatalities was an officer. But over time, as this massive toll decimated their ranks, the number began to slow dramatically. By spring of 2025, officers made up to closer to 2 to 3% of the newly confirmed dead. Not necessarily because Russian command tactics improved, but rather because the army was simply running out of experienced commanders. Instead, untrained conscripts, inexperienced volunteers, and hastily mobilized reservists were thrown into the relentless meat grinder. With little preparation, no adequate training, and minimal competent leadership remaining, the tragic outcomes for these soldiers was sadly predictable. For Ukraine, the human cost has been equally devastating. Approximately 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded defending their homeland, a catastrophic blow for a nation whose population is significantly smaller than Russia's. This immense loss has forced Ukraine into multiple waves of mobilization, drafting civilians from nearly every profession and walk of life. Unlike Russia, Ukraine lacks a nearly bottomless reserve of manpower and has little margin for error. With every battle, Ukraine loses not just trained soldiers, but also teachers, engineers, farmers, and artists, citizens who would have otherwise had helped rebuild their nation after the war. This war is already the deadliest European conflict since World War II. And every new passing day only amplifies its grim legacy. Both nations are now trapped in a ruthless battle of attrition. Now the question is, how much more bloodshed can either nation endure? Will Russia's large yet overstretched military collapse first under the relentless toll of casualties and economic pressure? Or will Ukraine's smaller, heavily battered population hit its breaking point sooner? In 2025, 51% of companies are already using AI. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all have laid off thousands due to it. 40% of people fear AI will take their jobs this year. It sounds scary, but here's what you're not seeing. They're also hiring. hiring people who understand AI, who can use AI tools, and those who can build with it. And this isn't just about jobs. If you run a business, freelance, or are building something of your own, AI isn't optional. It's leverage. The ones who learn AI now will outrun those who don't. So if you want to stay ahead, hire better, and build faster, start learning AI today. This is why I highly recommend joining this 2-day AI training, which takes you from beginner to advanced AI professional in just 16 hours. It's valued at $895, but I've partnered with Outskill to provide 1,000 free seats for my learners. It's happening this weekend from 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Saturday and Sunday. It's completely free, so find the link in the description to save your seat now before it expires. Their 2-day program includes 16 hours of live training, and it's free for Business Basics viewers. In this training, you'll learn a bunch of helpful stuff, from over 20 different AI tools to build your personal toolkit, to mastering prompt engineering for better results. You'll also explore how to analyze data without needing to code, use AI in Excel, and create slick presentations with ease. Plus, the training covers building tools and AI agents without writing any code, make eye-catching images and videos with AI, and automating your work to save time and get more done. This program is for everyone, whether you're in tech, sales, marketing, HR, operations, or even just running your own business. Over 4 million people from 120 plus countries have joined so far, and slots are filling up fast. Click the link in the description to book yours now. Back in the war's early weeks in 2022, Russia came dangerously close to Kyiv, but then Ukraine put up a fierce, unexpected resistance. By mid-2022, the war had turned into a grinding slugfest, with both sides stuck in heavy, grinding battles across eastern and southern Ukraine. Unable to achieve a quick, decisive victory through mobility and surprise, Russia reverted to what it knew best: heavy artillery barrages and large human wave assaults. Brutal tactics it had relied on since World War II and in Chechnya. Towns like Soledar and Bakhmut turned into killing fields. Russian units, often poorly led and sometimes filled with convicts recruited by the Wagner mercenary group, were repeatedly thrown straight into Ukraine's heavily defended positions, only to be slaughtered by the thousands. Analysts noted that regions like Tver in Siberia and Buryatia in the Far East had the highest death rates per capita in the war. For instance, tiny Tver had around 120 soldiers officially confirmed dead. With such a small local population, that translates to an unbelievable death rate of about 120 per 10,000 men, roughly 40 times the death rate of Moscow City. Neighboring regions like Buryatia and Altai Republic weren't doing much better either, each reporting roughly 90 war deaths per 10,000 men. But when you look at Moscow, home to Russia's wealthiest and most influential families, the death rate was just 3 per 10,000. And honestly, this huge difference isn't an accident. From day one, Putin's military relied heavily on soldiers from poorer rural areas and minority regions. Many of the troops initially sent to invade Ukraine were contract soldiers, drawn heavily from poor rural and minority regions. In places like Buryatia, Dagestan, and Altai, military service or signing up as a contract soldier has long been seen as one of the few viable career paths for young men. The pay, at least on paper, is far better than local wages. So when the war broke out, these regions naturally ended up supplying way more soldiers for the front line, and tragically bearing way more of the casualties. The Ukrainians, for their part, suffered heavy losses as well, holding each position until ammunition ran low and supplies became scarce. Only then, under the cover of darkness or artillery fire, would they slowly withdraw to fallback positions prepared days or weeks in advance. Territory rarely changed hands, yet the number of casualties continued to rise at a troubling pace. Just a few days ago, a US study estimated that of roughly 1 million Russian casualties, around 250,000 have likely been killed in action so far. To put that into historical context, it's higher than Russia's total military fatalities from nearly 10 brutal years in Afghanistan during the 1980s, 2 bloody wars in Chechnya throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, and numerous other smaller conflicts in Syria, Georgia, and elsewhere, all combined. Take all the Russian soldiers killed in those wars over multiple decades, multiply that number by 5, and you get the butcher's bill of Ukraine. That said, Western officials have also indicated, though they are never officially confirmed, that Ukraine's military deaths, while tragically high, might be roughly 1/4 or even 1/5 of Russia's total losses. Now, many of you guys have commented that you subscribe to the channel, but YouTube is not recommending our videos. Well, I asked YouTube about this, and according to YouTube, more than 75% of you guys are not subscribed. So please, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button down below. Let's start. However, even if Ukraine's losses are comparatively lower, they remain devastating in absolute terms. Tens of thousands of Ukraine's bravest defenders, those who stood firm in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Kherson, are gone forever. An even greater number are severely wounded, many permanently maimed. With a significantly smaller population than Russia, Ukraine feels each loss more deeply. A toll that Russia might withstand could be catastrophic for Ukraine. As the saying goes in war, demographics is destiny, and Ukraine's margin of error is extremely thin. By early 2024, after nearly 2 full years of relentless warfare, Ukraine's wartime population had shrunk to around 37 million people. Russia, meanwhile, still retained roughly 146 million, almost quadruple Ukraine's remaining population. According to the 2024 Global Firepower Survey, Ukraine's available pool of military-age adults stands at about 19 million, with approximately 15 million of them healthy enough for active duty. Each year, roughly 418,000 Ukrainians reach the age.
That's probably why they're losing too. That's such like a broad statement to say, like they're healthy enough, dude. What the fuck does that mean? Like I'm probably healthy enough to fucking join the military. That doesn't mean I should. Like I recently was just told by my doctor, like a month or two ago, that I should go see a heart doctor. Like they said that they like found like my heart rate was like irregular, but everything else seemed like normal for the most part. It's like I don't know, man.
Age of military service. Russia's numbers are, of course, significantly larger. Nearly 70 million potential soldiers, 47 million considered medically fit for duty, and around 1.3 million young Russians annually entering military age. On top of that, Russia can immediately mobilize around 5 million trained troops, with an overall mobilization capacity stretching as high as 20 million. This immense pool explains why, even after 3 relentless years of warfare, Putin shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. Instead, he's tapping deeper and deeper into Russia's enormous human reserves, determined to feed the brutal conflict indefinitely. After all, if losing around 1,000 Russian soldiers every single day hasn't deterred the Kremlin yet, you have to ask, what possibly could? Maybe demographics and society could. You see, despite Russia's overwhelming numerical advantage, with over 140 million people compared to Ukraine's roughly 37 million, Putin might be risking far more than he realizes. Even before the war, Russia's population was rapidly aging and shrinking due to critically low birth rates and alarmingly short life expectancy, especially among men. Now, the war is dramatically accelerating that decline, draining away tens of thousands of Russia's youngest, healthiest men, either sending them to early graves or returning them severely injured, unable to fully contribute to society ever again. Every soldier lost today is a worker, a husband, or a father that will be absent tomorrow. Putin's war is triggering a massive exodus among Russia's younger generation, especially the educated, skilled workers and students, crucial for the nation's future growth. Since the start of the invasion, especially after Putin's partial mobilization order in September of 2022, over 700,000 Russians have fled the country. Some independent estimates put this number closer to 1 million.
Hold that thought, I'm gonna say something, brother. Let me get a drink. Yeah, I'm honestly not even shocked at the numbers of the amount of people that want to leave Russia. Because, like, dude, think about it. Most people don't even want this war to happen. They don't even know why the fuck they're even fighting this war. Like, who cares if these people want to be their own people and have their own land? Like, you guys have, your country's already big enough. Like, what the fuck are you even... Why are you even fighting this shit, dude? Like, it's one thing if these people, if half of Ukraine wanted to be Russian, the other half didn't or some shit. But no, dude, the majority of Ukraine doesn't want anything to do with Russia.
Million. For Ukraine, the demographic situation is far.
So what do you expect? You have the majority majority of your population that, doesn't even want to be fighting this war? What makes you think that they even want to be in the country at this point?
Are more severe. But comparing it to Russia doesn't really make sense, given what Ukraine is facing. Unlike Russia, Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of choosing when or how to end the war, because they're not just fighting a war, they're fighting for their homeland's very survival.
Yeah.
If Ukraine loses, it loses everything. The country as we know it could literally cease to exist. It explains why Ukrainians keep fighting so fiercely despite the heavy toll. Today, virtually every single Ukrainian from Donetsk to Lviv knows someone who's been wounded or killed. The war has touched everyone, young and old, men and women. Yet if Ukraine manages to win, they'll have at least a chance to rebuild their nation, even if it means starting from absolute zero. The unsolvable problem, at least for now, is that Ukraine has already carried out multiple waves of mobilization since the war began in 2022. And even though millions of Ukrainians remained willing to defend their homes, the supply of skilled, experienced fighters simply isn't endless. By 2024, Ukraine was forced into mobilizing older volunteers, men in their 40s and 50s who, under normal circumstances, might never have been considered frontline material. The professional army, the veterans who bravely resisted Russia's initial invasion in 2022, was largely decimated or severely depleted. Throughout 2023, their ranks were gradually replenished by newer, less experienced recruits, driven by patriotism, but inevitably lacking the same level of combat readiness. By early 2025, yet another entirely new iteration of Ukraine's army is fighting. Battle-hardened for sure, but also worn down by endless, relentless combat. Their resilience has earned global admiration, but even the most resilient forces have their limits. This fierce Ukrainian resilience is exactly why Russia resorted to directly targeting Ukraine's civilian population and critical infrastructure. Starting in late 2022, Russia launched wave after wave of missile and drone strikes deliberately aimed at civilian power grids, transformers, utilities, bridges, roads, and rail lines, even to the point of putting a deadly hole in the containment dome of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. With these attacks, Putin had just one goal: to make ordinary Ukrainians suffer so much that their morale would shatter, breaking their spirit to resist. And for a while, it got really bad, especially in the winter of 22-23. Millions of Ukrainians had to endure weeks on end without electricity, heat, or running water. At the worst point, over 10 million people, nearly a quarter of Ukraine's entire pre-war population, were left completely in the dark after massive Russian missile strikes. Hospitals struggled desperately to keep vital equipment running on backup generators. There were even heartbreaking reports of people getting sick or dying due to cold, accidents, and the breakdown of essential services. Yet through all of this, somehow Ukraine's spirit didn't break. If anything, they became even tougher. Crews worked non-stop, around the clock, repairing power stations almost as fast as Russia could hit them. People shared what little heat, power, or food they had with their neighbors. Still, Russia's relentless targeting of civilian areas had horrific consequences. According to the United Nations, more than 12,300 Ukrainian civilians, including at least 650 children, have been confirmed killed since the full-scale invasion began. What makes it even more disturbing is that the United Nations openly admits these numbers barely scratch the surface. The true number of innocent people killed is undoubtedly much higher. Some events, like the siege of Mariupol, are particularly horrific. Russian bombardment systematically flattened entire city blocks. Families spent days trapped underground, shivering in dark basements with almost no food or water as shells fell non-stop above them. When it was finally over, Mariupol's mayor estimated around 21,000 civilians had been killed, an unimaginable number for just one city in just weeks. It got so bad that mass graves had to be hastily dug in courtyards because entire cemeteries ran out of space. Then there's Bucha, a town just outside Kyiv, where retreating Russian troops left behind streets lined with the bodies of civilians who'd been executed. Then there's the displacement crisis. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that around 10.6 million Ukrainians, almost a quarter of the country's pre-war population, have been forced from their homes. Millions are living abroad in Poland, Germany, and elsewhere across Europe, desperately trying to rebuild some sense of normal life, all while longing for the day that they can safely return home. And finally, there are the silent, invisible casualties. Most people don't talk about this, but modern battlefield medicine saves far more wounded soldiers today than it could have in the past. And while that's undeniably good, it also means that tens of thousands of Ukrainians now face life-altering injuries. By the middle of 2023, only a year and a half into the full-scale war, between 20,000 and 50,000 Ukrainians had already lost at least one limb due to battle injuries. To put this into perspective, that's roughly equal to the total number of amputees Britain or Germany each had throughout all 4 brutal years of World War I. And keep in mind, this estimate doesn't even include all the severe fighting that has happened since mid-2023. Given how relentless the war has been since then, the actual number of Ukrainian amputees today is almost certainly far higher. Kyiv's hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and prosthetics clinics have been absolutely overwhelmed. Thousands of patients, young men and women who should have been building their futures, are instead learning to walk again with artificial limbs, trying to adapt to life without arms, or struggling just to perform everyday basic tasks. But even in this heartbreaking situation, many wounded soldiers have publicly committed themselves to returning to active duty, determined to keep fighting, even after devastating injuries. Meanwhile, Russia is facing a far more severe and inhumane situation than Ukraine. According to insiders from the Russian Military Medical Service, out of Russia's total wounded, over 60,000 injuries have required at least one limb to be amputated. Field surgeons have reported that they receive so many serious blast injuries every week that they often find themselves performing amputations almost automatically whenever blood flow to a limb is in doubt, even for injuries that Ukraine or NATO hospitals would routinely be able to treat and save. Multiple intercepted communications released by Ukraine's intelligence services have further exposed the ruthless mindset of some Russian officers. Officers have openly instructed medics and frontline troops to leave the heavies behind, meaning soldiers who are so severely injured that they can't walk on their own, because carrying them might slow down the pace of the assault. Independent human rights organizations like Gulag.net.
Dude, this is why Russia rarely wins anything, dude, because they have like no conviction. They can't even follow like the #1 rule of like being comrades in a war, never leave a man behind. What the fuck, bro? You're just instructing people to leave them behind? Like, what?
Have documented dozens of first-hand accounts from traumatized Russian conscripts, detailing how wounded comrades were abandoned, left behind to slowly bleed out alone. Evacuation vehicles and medical resources are often prioritized exclusively for officers, leaving ordinary conscripts to suffer agonizing deaths that, under different leadership, would have been entirely avoidable. The worst affected of them all are the prison recruits in the infamous Storm Z units. These units, filled mainly with convicts, face the worst treatment imaginable. If a wounded prisoner can still breathe, commanders order him to crawl forward into battle. If he can't move or breathe, commanders conveniently mark him as missing, letting the army dodge paying compensation to his family. Similarly, Russia's medical chain is just as bad. Russia entered this war with less than 200 modern armored ambulances for the entire army, and they lost most of those within the war's first 6 months. Even today, basic frontline medical kits still don't have simple tourniquets, items considered mandatory and life-saving in all NATO militaries. Field hospitals lack skilled vascular surgeons, doctors who could save injured limbs, so instead they're forced into rapid amputations, removing limbs that Ukraine or NATO hospitals could have easily saved. Ukraine, backed heavily by the US and EU donations, now regularly deploys portable negative pressure surgical theaters directly to the front line, routinely performing limb-saving microsurgery within just 6 hours after a soldier is injured. And even in cases where Russia does manage to save a soldier's life, what happens next is perhaps even crueler. Rehabilitation is practically non-existent. In March of 2025, a desperate letter from the St. Petersburg Prosthetics Institute was publicly leaked. They were literally begging the Russian Defense Ministry for carbon fiber prosthetic components. They pointed out that the budget provided by the government for 2024 covered barely 15% of what they actually needed, whereas Ukraine sends its wounded soldiers to state-of-the-art Western-funded rehabilitation centers like the Superhuman Center in Lviv, where patients get fitted with 3D printed sockets, advanced myoelectric hands, and extensive rehabilitation, all completely free. It's not that Russia isn't capable of treating its soldiers humanely, but that Russian leadership deliberately chooses not to, purely as a way to save money. Putin promised families compensation of up to 5 million rubles, about $55,000, for soldiers severely injured or killed in battle, which is why Russian commanders often falsely classify fallen soldiers as missing in action or deserters, which legally cancels out pension or compensation payments. Families of dead conscripts frequently get notifications that their sons are simply missing, leaving them financially helpless and emotionally tormented. One mother from Saratov even recorded an officer coldly explaining to her that it was simply cheaper for the motherland if her missing son was never found. These are some of the reasons why Russia's Independent Soldiers' Mothers Committee has already logged over 11,000 formal complaints about unpaid compensation. Even if Russia suddenly chose to fix this injustice and pay all the families, financially it's almost impossible. We'll dive deeper into the economic details soon, but here's the main point. Right now, Russia's biggest financial priority is funding its military-industrial complex. because they're losing military hardware at an astonishing rate, even faster than Leonardo DiCaprio loses girlfriends after they turn 25. Confirmed estimates already placed Russia's tank losses at well over 2,000, but unofficial sources indicate the real figure could be as high as 10,000 tanks destroyed or captured since the invasion began. Add to that roughly 23,000 armored fighting vehicles, around 29,000 artillery systems, and at least 51,000 transport vehicles, fuel tankers, and many other equipment. Officially, the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian equipment loss is about 5-1 in Ukraine's favor. Ukraine, of course, has also lost a significant chunk of its own military hardware. The difference is that Western allies are constantly stepping in to replenish these losses, often replacing them with newer, even more advanced weapons. But just like military personnel, another critical question is, which side will run out of ammunition and equipment first? In pure numbers, Russia started this war with massive stockpiles. They've even reopened old Soviet-era factories to crank out artillery shells, ammunition, and simpler weapons at scale. However, strict international sanctions are actively choking off Russia's access to critical high-tech components needed for precision-guided missiles, advanced drones, and complex electronics. Ukraine, on the other hand, depends almost entirely on Western-supplied ammunition, fuel, and high-end military gear, a dependency that could turn problematic if political support in Western countries weakens or falters. Both sides' war machines are under tremendous strain. Russia struggles to maintain self-sufficiency under crushing sanctions, while Ukraine faces the constant risk that its lifeline, Western support, might shrink or even just disappear. If World War I was fought and won by those who had more factories, coal mines, and steel mills, then the Russia-Ukraine war is being decided by who can keep their global supply chains running and alliances strong. It's not just about who has more tanks or missiles, but who can reliably replace them faster, better, and for longer. On that note, let's get into the raw economics. Russia's government has poured an enormous amount of money into keeping its war machine running. By 2024, Russia's military spending surged to around 6.7% of its total GDP. That's a staggering amount of money, higher than any point since the peak of the Soviet Union's Cold War spending. Most of this huge budget has gone directly into making new missiles and tanks to replace the ones destroyed by Ukraine, feeding hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hiring mercenaries, and running extensive propaganda campaigns, and maintaining all the machinery needed to keep the conflict going. But every ruble spent on the war is one less ruble Russia can spend on schools, hospitals, roads, or any basic civilian infrastructure. And it's already clear that Russian society is starting to feel the strain, and protests are emerging everywhere. Yet, under Putin's authoritarian system, the Kremlin has managed, at least for now, to keep the economy from collapsing completely and to limit the public outcry. They've achieved this partially by mobilizing only a segment of society, like poor ethnic minorities and far-flung regions, for conscripts, thus sparing the wealthier and politically influential families in Moscow or St. Petersburg from the worst impacts of the war. Another major reason Russia's economy hasn't completely collapsed yet is the steady stream of revenue it still gets selling its oil and gas. Ever since the war began, oil and gas have consistently accounted for over half of Russia's entire federal budget. At certain points in 2024, that figure even reached nearly 60%. With Western countries no longer buying Russian oil due to strict sanctions imposed right after the invasion, Russia quickly turned east. China and India stepped in as major buyers. By early 2024, Russia has become India's top oil supplier, providing nearly 40% of India's entire crude oil imports, up dramatically from less than 2% before the war. China has also increased its oil purchases from Russia. By the start of 2025, China was importing more than 2 million barrels of Russian oil every single day, almost double the pre-war levels. These huge sales have allowed Russia to keep its economy barely afloat, despite being heavily isolated from global markets and banned from trading with most Western countries. But it's also a massive risk that about half of Russia's crude oil exports now go to just these two countries, India and China. This puts Russia in a very vulnerable spot. Both India and China realize how much leverage they have and use it to demand steep price cuts. Sometimes Russia ends up selling its oil at around $30 per barrel below the international market price. According to a Bloomberg report from early 2025, these forced discounts are costing Russia tens of billions of dollars each year, money it badly needs to keep funding its war. But at the same time, Russia simply can't afford to lose these customers, so these discounts are unavoidable. India, for instance, has already hinted at reducing its reliance on Russian oil by reopening negotiations with Middle Eastern suppliers to diversify its sources.
I don't even know why, like, Russia... I mean, India, of all people, should be the last, the last, nation having to rely on Russia. Like, they're good all on their own. India does not need Russia, bro.
economies. At the same time, China's economy has been shaky due to lingering financial issues, weakening industrial output, and declining consumer demand, making it uncertain if China will continue buying large amounts of discounted Russian oil indefinitely. Returning to selling oil and gas to Europe or other Western countries really isn't an option anymore. In 2025, pipeline exports to the EU dropped by over 80% compared to before the war. Europe has shifted to liquefied natural gas from the US, Qatar, and elsewhere, permanently cutting Russia out of its most profitable energy market. On top of this, in February of 2025, the G7 and the EU introduced further sanctions targeting Russian refined petroleum products like diesel and jet fuel, making it even harder for Russia to find buyers. Russia's refining sector, previously profitable, has seen margins shrink dramatically due to limited market access and rising shipping and insurance costs. According to Bloomberg data from March of 2025, Russia's total fossil fuel revenues have fallen by around 40% from pre-war levels, creating huge strains on the Kremlin's budget. Domestically, Russia's economy is also struggling. By early 2025, inflation hovered at around 12%, and the value of the ruble was highly volatile. To fight rising inflation and support its currency, the Russian central bank had to repeatedly raise interest rates throughout 2024. Eventually,
Oh my god. It's just like these guys, dude. You know, once, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me 3 times, if you let it get to 3 times, I don't know what that would tell you.
reaching nearly 15%. Such high interest rates severely damaged business investments and consumer spending. Officially, Russia's economy shrank by about 3.5% in 2024 alone. But private economists think the real damage is far worse. Meanwhile, it goes without saying that Ukraine's economy is completely devastated. In 2022 alone, during the invasion's brutal early months, Ukraine's GDP collapsed by around 30%. Remarkably, the country avoided total economic collapse thanks to huge amounts of international aid and an impressive ability to adapt. Businesses quickly moved westward away from battle zones. Farmers somehow kept planting even on land mined or bombed out, and factories overnight switched from civilian goods production to making drones, armor, or other crucial military equipment. All of this prevented total collapse, but as of today, the country remains on financial life support. Western allies, the US, the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, continue sending tens of billions of dollars each year. By late 2024, according to Ukraine's own official budget data, roughly half of the government's entire budget came directly from external aid. This money pays crucial costs like soldier salaries, pensions, social services, hospitals, and emergency repairs to damaged infrastructure. Altogether, Ukraine has received over $150 billion in promised assistance from Western nations. The downside is that the longer this war drags on, the more dependent Ukraine becomes on this external aid. It's incredibly difficult to rebuild a stable, self-sufficient economy when missiles and artillery are still following daily. Russia shows no signs of stopping anytime soon, and the war could easily drag on another 2 years, maybe even 5 or 10. We've seen brutal wars of attrition like this before. One clear example is the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Often called the first modern war of attrition, it dragged on relentlessly for 8 exhausting years. From 1980 to 1988, over 1 million people died, and millions more were left permanently wounded or maimed. Both nations threw everything they had into the fight. Thousands of tanks, fighter jets, artillery shells, chemical weapons, even tragic waves of child soldiers and poorly trained young conscripts. Yet, after all the unimaginable bloodshed, the borders ended up almost exactly where they had started, demonstrating just how futile these grinding, drawn-out wars usually become. Economically, the cost to both sides was catastrophic. By the war's end, Iran had suffered massive losses, roughly $500 billion worth of economic damage that set the country back by decades. Meanwhile, Iraq, despite receiving enormous financial aid and generous loans from wealthy Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, as well as support from Western powers, still found itself buried under nearly $80 billion in debt. That crippling financial burden severely destabilized Iraq's economy and directly contributed to Saddam Hussein's reckless decision to invade Kuwait in 1990, triggering yet another devastating, destructive conflict, the Gulf War. But today's Russia-Ukraine conflict carries even more dangerous and unpredictable risks. Unlike Iran and Iraq, Russia is a nuclear-armed superpower. This means if Vladimir Putin ever truly felt cornered, pushed into a desperate position with no way out, even a small number of nuclear strikes could instantly end the conventional war. But if Russia ever made that catastrophic choice, it would effectively
crazy,
doom
man.
itself, instantly facing absolute isolation and crushing retaliation from the international community. In short, nuclear escalation is terrifyingly possible, but it's also essentially suicide. Beyond the nuclear threat, the scale and intensity of the war continues to rapidly escalate. Ukraine is no longer just defending its own territory. Instead, it's taking the fight directly into Russia. Over the past year, Ukraine has stepped up drone strikes, sabotage missions, and targeted attacks far inside Russian borders. Just recently, in June of 2025, Ukraine drones carried out a daring strike, successfully destroying several Russian strategic bombers, the same planes Russia relies on to launch cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities. With drones worth just a few $100,000, Ukraine managed to inflict an estimated $7 billion in damage on Russia. Yet despite all their achievements and small victories, neither side is anywhere near achieving what they originally set out to do. Russia hasn't been able to decisively defeat Ukraine or break its people's determination to resist. Meanwhile, Ukraine, even with incredible bravery and extensive Western support, still hasn't managed to take back large parts of its occupied territory. Peace talks have repeatedly begun, stalled, and ultimately fallen apart, often overshadowed by fresh offenses, horrifying civilian atrocities, and escalating violence.
Like, bro, a side that is willing to just leave their own men behind, you know, and like claim that they're missing just so that they won't have to pay out the families, but that's not a side that wants peace, brother. That is a side that wants war.
Violence that only makes each side more determined to fight on.
No
For Ukraine, accepting any peace deal without fully reclaiming its territory would feel like surrender. For Russia, even a partial withdrawal or compromise would mean admitting humiliation and defeat. Right now, the stakes literally couldn't be higher. Europe's entire security architecture, the fundamental international principle that one country can't just invade another and seize its territory, and above all, the lives and futures of tens of millions of people, all hang in the balance. Perhaps new game-changing weapons or innovative battlefield strategies might tip the scales? Maybe rising international pressure or internal unrest and discontent within Russia itself could eventually force Putin to rethink his strategy. Or maybe, tragically, this war will simply continue grinding forward relentlessly, consuming more lives, draining more resources, and destroying more families until one side finally breaks underneath the unbearable weight of human and economic losses. Until that moment finally arrives, whenever and however far away it may be, the millions of ordinary Ukrainians and Russians caught in the middle have no real choice but to endure the suffering.
Yeah, I honestly feel bad for mostly the Ukrainians, but also the Russian civilians and the Russian, basically the Russian civilians now, because most of them are being forced to go fight this war, and a lot of them don't even want to do that crap. You saw right there, 700,000 people just fleeing the country. It's a whole lot of people, man. That should, you know, ring some bells. Maybe you're not doing the right thing. Maybe this is all just kind of nonsense, yeah. Anyways, that's enough for this video. I don't want to make this one too long, given that I just put out like a 3-hour one. So hopefully you guys like this. Make sure to go check out Business Basic stuff. I'll leave the links again. Make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe on my channel, and go check out the Twitch and the Kick. I will see you guys in the next one.